Good afternoon. Welcome to Headset Network. Friend, as you know, we are having discussion on media laws, and we have already have two lectures on this. And today we have another lecture on media laws, and the precise topic is Freedom of Press and PRV Act 1867. How this act is being applied and what the modification has been made over the years. We will discuss all these things. And for discussion, we have in studio Dr. Anand Pradhan. He is currently associate professor in IMC New Delhi, and his face is familiar with all of you. And he's a well-known political commentator. So I think his view, experience and knowledge will help us to understand this act and the freedom of press in a new perspective. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Pradhan for EduSet lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Amrendraji, and a very warm good afternoon to all my viewers, faculty members, students, all over the country and also all over the world. It's my pleasure to be here to discuss a very important subject today, that is freedom of the press. As you remember, we have already discussed issues related to media freedom and also the political freedoms. Today, I have planned to discuss with you issues related to freedom of the press. Why we are discussing freedom of the press? As we have already discussed freedom of speech and expression, and why freedom of speech and expression is an important part of any democratic setup. And in some of the judgments and also some of the democratic philosophers and thinkers and political scientists have also observed that freedom of speech and expression is basically mother of all liberties. And because freedom of speech and expression is mother of all liberties, how we express, how we use this freedom of speech and expression, one of the most important component or most important form of freedom of speech and expression is freedom of the press. So today we are going to discuss the issues related to the freedom of the press. Why freedom of the press? Because freedom of the press, why it is so important? It is simple extension to the press of the fundamental individual rights to freedom of speech and expression. As we all know that the basic right is freedom of speech and expression, and this freedom of speech and expression is extended to the freedom of the press, because if anyone wants to express his views, his opinion, his aspirations, his ideas, he needs some kind of instrument or some form of expression, and the freedom of the press allows them to express their views and opinions. And also, as we have discussed last time, that the freedom of the press is also guaranteed. It is not mentioned in the Indian Constitution expressly, but as we all know, it is part of the freedom of speech and expression, because Supreme Court in many judgments said that freedom of speech and expression cannot be exercised without right to know. So right to know is important part of freedom of speech and expression, and without knowing everything in and around you, you cannot express your opinion, views or ideas. So that is why freedom of press is very important component of freedom of speech and expression, and basically it is an extension of that right to the press. It is closely related to the libertarian thoughts which had its origin in the writing of Milton, Areopagitica. We all know Areopagitica, in which Milton has articulated his views related to the libertarian thought or about thoughts about the freedom of speech and expression. Philosophical support was found in the writings of John Stuart Mill on liberty, his famous book on liberty, and I would like to quote here John Stuart Mill about the freedom of speech and expression, what he said about the importance of freedom of speech and expression, why it is so important. He said, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity, not only the current existing human race, but also the posterity, the future generation, as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion, even more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. So, according to John Stuart Mill, the importance of freedom of speech and expression is why we value so much the dissenting voices, because when we allow the collision of dissenting voices, they may allow us to reach to the truth. That is why freedom of speech and expression is also basically search for the truth. So when we allow collision of idea of freedom of speech or dissenting voices with the idea of any error we may have, so if that opinion is even wrong, then we may have a very clearer picture, we may have a very right perception about what is right or what is truthful or what is accurate. But even if it is not, suppose if it is right, then whatever wrong we were believing, whatever wrong we may be thinking that this is the truth, that may be corrected. So that is the importance of dissent, or that is the importance of the idea of freedom of speech and expression. So a free press has thus been seen as an essential component of a free and rational society, and that is why we all know that in many democratic setups we value dissent, we value opposition, we value those ideas which are not in conformity with the existing or the dominant ideas, and that is why we say why democratic form of governance is so a live form, or why it is very important for humankind, because it allows all type of views to express their opinion, because it allow all kind of opinions, views, ideas to collide with each other, to exchange ideas and issues with each other, and to reach truth by discussing, debating different ideas. So this gives us space and scope to debate and discuss. And freedom of the press is one of the important part, because as we all know, press is basically a platform where all type of ideas and opinions are discussed and debated. Because we all know in democratic setup there are so many institutions. Press is one of the important institution, as we all know. Press is, as we know, that it is called fourth state of any democratic governance system. And because it is a fourth state, it's a platform where all kind of ideas, issues, opinions can be discussed and debated, and by this we can enrich our democratic process, we can enrich our governance system, we can enrich even our thought process. That is why freedom of the press is so important. What are the requirements for media freedom? When we say media freedom or freedom of the press, what are the requirements? What are the environment we need to allow to flourish the idea of media freedom or the freedom of the press? The first thing is, media freedom to be realized, there must also be access to channels and opportunities to receive diverse kind of information. So when we say media freedom, it means that there should be a diverse kind of information available to us, and people must have access to the different channels and opportunities to receive diverse kind of information and opinion. And we will discuss about that later when we will see how Supreme Court interpreted when Indian Constitution, which says under Article 19(1) freedom of speech and expression, and why they said that it must be very important that people should have access to different channels and opportunity to receive diverse kind of information. Second requirement for media freedom is media freedom or the freedom of information and communication has a dual aspect. First, it offers a wide range of voices. So when we say freedom of information or freedom of communication or freedom of press, it means offering a wide range of voices and also responding to a wide ranging demand or need for information. So there is, on the one hand, we are allowing wide range of voices, opinions, views to be expressed. On the other hand, we are also fulfilling the demand of wide range of people who may be requiring different kind of information, different kind of ideas, different kind of views, different kind of opinions. So it's very important that we must consider or we must know that freedom of information and communication has a dual aspect. On the one hand, there must be a wide range of voices. On the other hand, they must respond to wide ranging demand for need for different type of information. It also needs absence of censorship. When we say freedom of the press, which means there should not be any kind of censorship, licensing or other control by the government, so that there is an unhindered right to publish and disseminate news and opinion, and no obligation to publish what one does not wish to. So when we say freedom of the press, which means complete absence of pre-censorship or any kind of censorship which may obstruct publication of any information which the newspaper editor or the publisher may want to communicate. On the other hand, it also means that whatever we don't want to publish as editor or as a journalist or as a publisher or as a printer, we should not be forced to publish that information in our newspaper. So it's a complete absence of censorship. Secondly, the equal right and possibility for citizens for free reception and access to news, views, education and culture. When we say freedom of the press or freedom of speech and expression, it also means equal right and possibility for every citizen for free reception and access to news, views, education and culture. Freedom for news media to obtain information from relevant sources. When we say freedom of the press, it's very important to understand here. When we say freedom of the press, it also means that media has freedom to gather information from different sources. So when a journalist is moving and talking and collecting or gathering information from different sources, state and no law agency can obstruct the functioning of or the duties of a journalist, which he may be or she may be collecting information or gathering information from different sources. That is their right to collect, to gather information from different sources, and freedom of the press ensures that. Also, absence of concealed influence from media owners or advertisers on news selection and on opinion expressed. I think this is very, very important. Why this is important? When we say freedom of the press, it does not mean only the freedom of owners or the publishers or the printers. It also means the freedom of the journalist, and which means, and because newspapers, as Supreme Court said in its judgment, that newspaper, because in our constitution, in Indian constitution, there is no special mention of freedom of the press, because Supreme Court interpreted that freedom of speech and expression also extend to the press, because they fulfill the demand of our right to know. Because when we say freedom of speech and expression also means our right to know, because without knowing anything we cannot express or we cannot exercise freedom of speech and expression. So there should be no concealed influence from media owners or advertisers on news selection. That which means no media owners or advertisers should, and what I am saying, it's an ideal situation. It's a situation in where it may not be mentioned in our constitution, it may not be mentioned in our different Supreme Court judgments, but the spirit of this idea of freedom of the press is basically any kind of absence of concealed influence from media owners or advertisers on news selection and opinion expressed, that they should not interfere in the working of journalists or the editors. They are independent ones, and they should exercise what kind of news they want to communicate, what kind of news they want to publish, and what kind of opinion they want to express. And there should not be any concealed, open or direct influence on editors or journalists to express this view or that view. Also, an active and critical editorial policy in presenting news and opinion. In democratic setup, freedom of the press means we need a press which must be very critical. Very critical means they should behave like fourth estate. As we all know, in a democratic setup, all the three states, legislature, judiciary and executive, are working in a check and balance system. So press has a role of watchdog. So as a role of watchdog, they must perform a very critical role of what governments are doing, what legislature is doing, what our judiciary is doing, and they should be critical. They should be critical because we know the importance of dissenting voices, because we know the importance of critical voices in democracy, because it is basically the right of the common citizens. They want to know what is happening with our government, what is happening with our legislature, what is happening with our judiciary, what is happening in overall governance and the system. And that is how, because we know everything about what is happening in and around us, we can exercise our franchise. So it is important for all of us that there should be an active and critical editorial policy in presenting news and opinion. These prescriptions, and here is very important, these prescriptions, whatever we have discussed, assume that only legitimate interests to be served are those either of communicators or of citizens or both. Which means when we say freedom of the press, it means that we should only cater to the legitimate interest of communicators, means journalists, the writers, the opinion makers, and also of citizens, those who are receiving our newspapers, who are reading our newspapers, or who are watching our television channels, who are listening our radio stations, and or both, communicator as well as receivers. Both have legitimate interest in the freedom of the press, and the freedom of press also serves both, which means on the one hand it also allows people to express their opinion, on the other hand it allows citizens to receive important information from their sources or communicators. Now, but there are conflict and inconsistencies in this whole idea of freedom of the press. What are the inconsistencies and conflicts? Freedom of public communication or media can never be absolute. When we say freedom of the press, it never be absolute, but has to recognize limits sometimes set by private interest of others or by the higher collective good of a society. So sometimes when we say freedom of the press, it is never, or freedom of speech and expression, it is never absolute. There are limitations, there are restrictions, and we have to recognize the limits sometimes set by the private interest, sometimes by, as we may be saying, as I have already mentioned, that there should not be any concealed influence from the owners or the advertisers, but we know that sometimes there are influences coming from the owners or pressure coming from the owners or the advertisers to not to publish such information or not to publish this advertisement or not to publish this or that information in the newspaper or the magazine. But we have to also recognize that sometimes there may be some restrictions because the higher collective good of society may want that, and we will discuss about that, what kind of restrictions or restrictions are there on freedom of the speech and expression. There is potential conflict of interest between owner or controllers of media channels and those who might want to access to the channels but have no power or legal right to secure it either as a senders or receivers. So there is a potential conflict of interest between owner and controller of media channels on the one hand, on the other hand those who are receiving those information. So sometimes what may happen that you may want to express your opinion or views, but you may not have access to that channel because that channel or that newspaper or television channel or maybe radio station may not be allowing you to express your opinion, because that is the inconsistency, that is the conflict in freedom of speech and expression. Because when we allow anybody to start newspaper, it is his newspaper. Whatever he wants to express or communicate opinion, he can communicate, he can express his opinion. But if you want as a citizen to also express your opinion in that newspaper, they may stop you. And there is no rule, there is no law which can guarantee your access to that newspaper or television channel. It is the basically editorial discretion that whatever they want to publish, they want to publish, they may publish that item only, they may not publish other items. That is their right. There may be an imbalance between what senders want to say and what others want to hear, which means this is again a very important contradiction in freedom of speech and expression. Sometimes television channels or radio stations or newspapers may be publishing or broadcasting something which listeners or viewers or readers may not want to listen or to hear or to read those items. But the senders, if senders wants to communicate those things, they may able to communicate those things, and they may not think or feel any pressure from their readers or listeners or viewers what they want to know, what there is their requirement. And that is a big inconsistency, that what others want to hear but you are not saying that to them. Also, another important inconsistency or conflict in freedom of the press is it may be necessary for government or public power to intervene to secure some freedoms which are not in practice delivered by unfettered system. So it may be necessary for government or public power to intervene, secure some freedom which are not in practice delivered by unfettered system. So it's important to understand. But before discussing about Indian case, let us discuss what are the benefits of media freedom. The first important benefit of media freedom or freedom of the press is systematic and independent public scrutiny of those in power, and supply of reliable information about their activities. I think in any democratic setup, this is the most important function of press. That is, a very systematic and independent public scrutiny of all those who are in the power or all those who are in the authority. And they scrutinize their behavior, they scrutinize their functioning, they scrutinize their decisions and policies, and inform public about those who are working or those who are in the power or in authority, and supply reliable information about their activities so that they can exercise their right to vote or select or choose their representatives whenever time for voting came, or whenever time of election came. They can decide whom to vote or which party to vote, because in democratic setup we want to know how our representatives are working, what they are doing, what our legislatures are doing, what our prime minister is doing, what our ministers are doing. And media or the press, basically what they do, they basically systematically and independently scrutinize the work of public officials. That is the most important benefit for any democratic setup or citizens they receive through the media. Second thing is stimulation of an active, informed democratic system and social life. Through media debates, through media discussion, what we do, we create an informed citizenry. That is why freedom of speech and expression and also freedom of the press is very important. For success of any democratic system, we need informed citizenry, which means people should know what is happening, what their leaders or what their representatives are doing, what public officials are doing. So they must be knowing what is happening in and around us, and also about ideas, also about views, also about different experiences happening in and around the world. So it basically, freedom of the press stimulates different ideas. It allows platform for different ideas to debated and discussed. So it's basically creates an intellectual rigor. It creates an intellectual environment where people and media can interact with each other and know what is most important thinking about any subject or issue. The chance to express ideas, belief, views about the world. It also allows us to express our ideas, our beliefs, our views about the world or what is happening in and around us. So it is basically allows us, media freedom or freedom of the press also provides us platform to express our opinion. One of the benefit of media freedom is continued renewal and change of culture and society, because media also creates a situation where different cultures interact with each other, and from media we basically what we do, we not only renew our culture, because it's a system of continuous renewal of our culture, but it also suggests or inculcate changes in culture and society, and it passes on that culture to from one generation to another generation. Increase in the amount and variety of freedom available. It also increases the amount and variety of freedom available, and it's very important. I would like to elaborate this. Why media freedom is so important? Because sometimes what our constitution has provided to us as a different type of rights or freedoms. When freedom of the press, we guarantee freedom of the press, sometimes press also challenges some of the restrictions imposed on our different freedoms or rights. Suppose there is in the constitution itself there is some restrictions on media freedom of speech and expression, and sometimes when press try to extend our freedom or do something which may create some kind of controversy, or sometimes may challenge some of the restrictions and test the limit of that, and in that way it also enhances, increases the possibility or amount and variety of freedoms available to us. I will give you one example. Government has right to tap telephone, and now issue of tapping telephone is very much in news. So as you know, when issue of tapping telephone came and when media used this issue, then it issue goes to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said yes, you can tap telephone, but but only with valid reasons and with set procedures. Without that you cannot tap telephone of any individual or any citizen, because when you tap telephone of any individual or citizen, it is basically violation of their privacy, and because privacy is very important part of our right to life, which is guaranteed under Article 21. So by this way media always extends our amount and variety of freedoms available to us, and it increases that amount. Now we are coming to our main issue, that is the Indian case. What is Indian Constitution said about freedom of speech and expression? Article 19 of the Constitution specifically guarantees to the citizens of India 6 basic freedoms: of speech and expression, of peaceful assembly without arms, to form association, of movement throughout India, of residing and settling in any part of India, and of practicing any profession and carrying on any occupation, trade or business. These are 6 basic freedom guaranteed under Article 19. But here we are more concerned about freedom of speech and expression, which is guaranteed under Article 19(1)(a). These freedoms are recognized as the natural rights inherent in the status of citizens, because as a citizen of this country we are inherently these are the natural rights of every citizens, and we inherit these rights as citizens of this country. The Indian Constitution confers on media no more and no less than the right due to it as an institution that benefits from the public right to free speech and expression as enshrined in Article 19(1). So basically this right is extended to the freedom of the press, because in Indian Constitution there is no separate or exclusive mention of freedom of the press. As mentioned in the United States Constitution, as you all know, in the United States with the First Amendment, in US Constitution said with First Amendment that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. So in the United States Constitution it is clearly mentioned in the Constitution, but in Indian Constitution freedom of the press is not mentioned. It is basically freedom of speech and expression, extension of freedom of speech and expression to the freedom of the press. The courts have again and again mentioned the freedom of press a fundamental right as part of the freedom of speech and expression. The right to the protection of the 6 freedoms against state action is available to all citizens. So whenever a state or any law agency try to interfere with any of these 6 freedom, you have always protection available to all citizens. Media freedom is derived from the right to free expression, which is in turn related to the public right to information. As we all know, it is basically, and we have already discussed again and again, that freedom of the press is guaranteed because, as Supreme Court explained, that it fulfills our as a citizen, our right as a citizen of right to know, because without knowing or without getting information through media or through press, we cannot exercise our freedom of speech and expression. So Supreme Court said that it is part of freedom of speech and expression. Media freedom is justified in whole or in part by the public function it performs. So media freedom is justified in whole or in part by the public function it performs. It is important to understand, because what media is doing, it is performing a public function of informing citizens and the wider community about the various facets of their lives and the time they live in. So because it is performing a public function of informing people or citizens, that is why their freedom is guaranteed in Indian Constitution, and that is why media is not like a business of selling or producing a soap or a toothpaste. It is much more than that, because it is performing a public function of informing people or citizens about what is happening in the wider community and also various facets of lives and the times they live in. But Article 19 does not confer an absolute or unlimited right. It's very important to understand. Article 19, under which we have freedom of speech and expression, never said that it is absolute or unlimited. The Supreme Court in A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras case clearly said that social interest in individual liberty may well have to be subordinated to other greater social interest. So yes, individual freedom is very important, but it should always be subordinated with other greater social interest or greater common good. So in greater common good, there may be some restrictions, or there may be a reason behind some kind of restriction on freedom of speech and expression in the larger interest of the society, in the larger interest of the nation, in the larger interest of the country. And accordingly, there are certain restrictions on freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(2) of the Constitution. And we must understand all these restrictions. It says that the state can impose reasonable restrictions on the exercise of the freedom of speech in the interest of, first, sovereignty and integrity of India. So you cannot challenge, you have freedom of speech and expression, but you cannot challenge sovereignty and integrity of the country. You cannot challenge the territorial integrity of the country. You cannot say that we want to secede from this country. It is not guaranteed under the Constitution. Also, but it's very important to understand here, you can debate and discuss, and in Supreme Court had also said that what is important here to understand, Supreme Court or even the Constitution said that there should be some reasonable restriction. The issue is reasonable. Any restriction related to sovereignty and integrity of India should be reasonable. It should not be a blanket. It should not be a blanket restriction in the name of sovereignty and integrity or safeguarding the sovereignty and integrity of India. In fact, Supreme Court said that you can debate and discuss the sovereignty and integrity of India or the territorial integrity of India, but you should not use arms. You should not encourage people to use violence to do that. So, you can discuss and debate sovereignty and integrity of India or territorial integrity of India, or you can say that you demand Telangana state. It's your right, you can ask, but you cannot demand or say that we want to secede from India, and you encourage people to use arms and to use violence to achieve that goal. So that may be not available to you under freedom of speech and expression, number one. Number two, friendly relations with foreign states. Another important restriction, reasonable restriction. You cannot damage friendly relations with foreign states, but again, this is a very reasonable restriction. You have to prove that whatever newspapers or freedom of the press and freedom of speech has guarantees to us, that whatever we are saying about any friendly state is really harming our friendly relationship with that country. So it is again reasonable restriction. The security of the state. So you cannot also challenge or disturb the security of the state. You cannot also disturb public order, decency or morality. So you are not free to publish anything which may challenge or which may against the public morality or decency. And there are so many numerous cases where newspapers or some of the artists or writers have written something which is challenged in the name of obscenity under the sometimes CRPC or sometimes IPC. We will discuss it later. There is also a reasonable restriction on freedom of speech and expression, and that is contempt of court. You have freedom of speech and expression, but you cannot go for contempt of the court, or you cannot criticize court in a manner which scandalizes the court. You have also no right to defame people. That is the defamation. And finally, there is another reasonable restriction, that you cannot incite people for an offense. That you have freedom of speech and expression, but you cannot encourage people or incite people to use violence or go for any other crime. That is not guaranteed under the Constitution. But restrictions imposed by the law must be reasonable and not arbitrary or of excessive nature, and the onus of proving it to the satisfaction if court lies with the state. So if you have written something and state challenges you and files some case, and if court starts listening this case or that case, in that case, state has to prove that this restriction on the freedom of speech and expression is reasonable, and why it is reasonable so. According to the Supreme Court, the harsher the restriction, the heavier the onus to prove the reasonableness. In Sagir Ahmad versus State of Uttar Pradesh case, Supreme Court clearly said that the harsher the restriction on freedom of speech and expression, the heavier the onus to prove that reasonableness. Since the Constitution does not define the expression reasonable restriction, because there is no mention or its clear definition of what it means by reasonable restriction, each case has to be judged on its own merit. So there is no clear-cut rule about reasonable restriction. That can be, if you feel that your freedom of speech and expression is hindered or restricted by the state, you can go to court, you can challenge that restriction, and in that case, state has to prove that why this restriction is reasonable. And court can listen or can hear each case according to its own merit. The reasonableness of restriction has to be determined not on abstract basis, but in objective manner and from the point of view of person upon whom the restrictions are imposed. So court will decide. A just balance has to be struck between the restriction imposed and social control envisaged by the Article 19(6). So accordingly, prevailing social values as also social needs which are intended to be satisfied by the restriction. So whenever courts judge the reasonableness of that restriction, they judge according to the prevailing social values as also social needs which are intended to be satisfied by the restrictions. there must be a direct and proximate nexus or reasonable connection between the restriction imposed and objects sought to be achieved by that act. That being so strong presumption in favor of the constitutionality of the act will naturally arise. In such situation, if court can decide whether this reasonable restriction is really reasonable or not, and it is the court which can decide according to the merit of each case. The Supreme Court in MRF Limited versus Inspector of Kerala government case has upheld that in examining the reasonableness of a statutory provision, one has to keep in mind. So court has also framed some kind of guideline in what circumstances or in when courts may be judging that this restriction is reasonable or not, they must go through these things. What are those statutory provisions? Number one, the directive principle of the state policy. What directive principles of the state policy says about that? Second, the restriction must not be arbitrary or of an excessive nature, going beyond the requirement of the interest of the general public. So that means that in the name of reasonable restriction, you cannot impose restrictions on freedom of speech and expression in a very arbitrary manner. No, there must be you should not be very excessive in the nature, and it should not go beyond the interest of the general public. No abstract or general pattern or a mixed principle to judge the reasonableness of the restrictions can be laid down so as to be universal application, and the same will vary from case to case. It's very important. Court itself said that it can discuss or it can go through any case of reasonable restriction case by case with regard to the changing condition, values of human life, social philosophy of the constitution, prevailing condition. What is the prevailing condition? Suppose there may be very disturbing situation in the country, and in that condition there may be some reasonable restriction. Court may say yes, that is the very reasonable restriction. But if there is a peace time and there are no such disturbances, and despite that if a state imposes some kind of restriction, court may say that no, this is not reasonable restriction, it is not according to the prevailing condition and surrounding circumstances. So these are some of the issues. Case of telephone tapping, unless it comes within the grounds of restriction under Article 19(2), would infringe Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution. So Supreme Court in PUCL versus Union of India case clearly said that telephone tapping, if it is not on the grounds of restriction under Article 19(2), which is the reasonable restrictions according to the security of a state, if it is threatening the security of the state, if it is against the integrity and sovereignty of the country, only in some reasonable circumstances or restrictions you can tap the telephone, and there must be reasonable reason behind this, and Supreme Court laid down the clear-cut procedure and guidelines for doing this. There are numerous cases where Supreme Court has upheld the freedom of press as very important part of freedom of speech. In Express Newspaper Private Limited versus Union of India case, the court observed, freedom of the press is at the heart of social and political intercourse. It is the primary duty of the courts to uphold the freedom of the press and invalidate all laws or administrative action which interfere with it contrary to the constitutional mandate. So court said in a very clear cut terms or manner that it is the primary duty of the courts to uphold the freedom of the press and invalidate all laws or administrative action which interfere with it contrary to the constitutional mandate. And what is the constitutional mandate? Constitutional mandate is the guarantee of freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a). Now, after discussing and debating so much about media freedom and importance of media freedom, why it is so important for a democratic setup. Now there are certain cases where media has crossed its Lakshman Rekha or its limit sometimes. And one of the issue which is nowadays very much debated in the media, that is trial by the media. You all must be knowing and debating and discussing this trial by media. There are many cases in recent years where enthusiastic media and sometimes sensational media, looking for some sensational scoop and stories, tarnished the image of the people. In many cases, they have tarnished the image of people. Generally, extensive pre-trial reports against an accused person declaring him or her as guilty of crime. What happens in trial by media is sometimes what media do in its enthusiasm for scoop and investigative reports. As we know, Constitution guarantees the fair trial of every accused. That is their right. They are not guilty. They have every right to have a fair trial. And when media, before completion of the trial, they announce somebody as a guilty, that is trial by the media. So, while freedom of the press is vital for ensuring that the public remain informed about progress of trial and helping to maintain accountability in the judicial system, the thin line between reporting facts and expressing opinions on them is being increasingly crossed, as happened in Arusi Talwar case. So we all know about that. In Arusi Talwar case, which is very famous, and I would not like to elaborate about that case, but in that case, even the Supreme Court observed, and in fact 2 years back, it restricted newspapers to publish speculative reports. It said that you can report court proceedings accurately. It is the right of the people to know about the development in that case, but you should not. It clearly said to the newspapers and television channels that you cannot report a speculative report, or you cannot tarnish the image of that little girl or their parents with suspicious report or speculative reports. Who is accountable for irreparable damage to the reputation? Supreme Court asked newspapers that you, without completing the trial and without declaring somebody as guilty, you declare people, media declares people as guilty, and in that case, who will be the responsible or who will be the accountable for irreparable damage? Because if you damage the reputation of any person, it is basically irreparable damage. So who will be the accountable for that irreparable damage to the reputation of any person? So the press is not a court or judge. We must understand that. Press is not a court or a judge. It is not also investigative agency. It is also not a police. So the role of the court is to provide justice, and it is justice which takes the most severe hit if an accused is already under a cloud of unjustified suspicion, or worse, has already been denounced as guilty by the media. So it is really the justice which hits most severe hit from the media trial. It can influence judges, as they are also human beings. Yes, judges, we believe that judges may not be influenced by the media coverage or media reporting, but judges are also human beings. So sometimes they may also be influenced. But this does not mean that media should not critically report. That's true. Media can report critically. There are numerous cases where media activism played important role in prosecution of guilty, particularly powerful people. As we all know about Jessica case, and there are so many other cases where, because of the activism of media, on the one hand, people blame media for media trial. On the other hand, there are also issues related to, because of the media activism, courts and the investigative agencies both have they in fact, because of the media pressure and media role, prosecution of guilty, particularly the powerful people, happened. But despite these examples, media cannot replace the justice delivery system. If we allow that to happen, that if media starts delivering justice, if we allow that to happen, it would spell disaster, as it is direct invitation to lynch mob mentality. So we should not allow this lynch mob mentality to overpower media sensitivity in such cases. The Supreme Court in many cases has observed that a trial by press or electronic media or public agitation is a very antithesis of the rule of law. It can only lead to miscarriage of justice. In some cases, it may attract contempt of court also. So now we are coming to the issues related to starting a press or newspaper. We can continue with that? Okay, let us discuss only press freedom of the press. And now, because we have a few minutes available to us, there may be some questions related to that. I would request Amren ji to, if he have some question, he can ask those questions.
Yeah. So, as you said, the trial by media, but what I guess, what I find, trial has also its own rule. Like one step lead to another, and then we reach to a conclusion, certain conclusion.
Yeah.
But here, one step is not following another, not reaching to conclusions, nothing. Just one line is repeating all the times. So trial is just a word given by the media to stop its trailing image. We can say. One thing is the second, the what we say, it's a miscarriage of justice. Miscarriage of justice. So, given in this circumstances, can we think that it's really good for the media and good for the listener, viewers who think, who held the media in high esteem?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a very important question. As we have already, you are indicating that our justice delivery system, sometimes it happens that it takes very long time. Generally, this is, our judicial system is blamed for that they are taking so much time. And sometimes powerful people, those who have money and resources, who can thwart whole process of justice. And in those cases, media activism or the media role to expose those things is very much appreciated. We should appreciate that. But in some cases, we must understand that in some cases, media have also crossed its Lakshman Rekha.
Have they crossed Lakshman Rekha? They have failed in their duty. They are not performing. That's why they are giving one term after another terms and just trying to be a stand firmly on in the say in the sentiment, in the sentiment of the masses, in the perception of that we are here. But the fact is they are doing nothing. Like even say in case of a scoop, you are finding a story. So far, they are destabilizing the system. We find the Dada Bhai Nauroji book about the wealth, poverty of India. That had an impact on the masses and also the British Empire, which were busy to thwart all the process. But media has not, though independent and they can do anything, they did nothing. Neither in Arusi Talwar case, nor in Jessica Lal case. They just bring out something which came out through the other sources, and they just highlighted it.
Amrindji, I think this is a bit very pessimistic view. Yes, I am also a critic of media. But in some cases, yes, media has played very important role also. We must recognize that. But in some cases, yes, they have crossed the Lakshman Rekha and issue is debated, and particularly, as I have already mentioned in Arusi Talwar case, Supreme Court had issued clear-cut guideline, and in fact it restricted media not to publish speculative reports about Arusi Talwar or about their parents or about the investigation by the CBI. What happens sometimes, actually, in many cases, because of the now media is 24/7 media, which is always looking for some sensational stories, and particularly crime stories, sometimes what happens, police is also parading so-called accused people. And they have also, according to our constitution, they have full right for a fair trial. So sometimes what media do, without even going through the trial or final investigation, whenever police caught someone in the suspicion, media, before even the investigation is not completed, like in Arusi Talwar case, they announce someone or their parents or in some cases someone else as culprit or as a guilty person. That is what I say a lynch mob mentality, where people catch some thief and they think that this is we should immediately give him some justice, or like a kangaroo court. We should not encourage such tendency. On the other hand, also I would suggest that it is, as Supreme Court and many courts have suggested and argued, that yes, it is right of every citizen to know about everything. So media is also performing, when they are reporting about every incident, they are performing the duty of or the function of informing people about what is happening in and around us.
Yeah, that's why my point is, instead of speculating, instead of reporting what is obvious to all of the media, should focus more on finding the truth, what is the facts behind this,
And
that is the primary job.
Yes, they should be. Yes, in that sense, I'm 100% agree with you that they should report fairly, they should report accurately, and they should try to find out the truth behind that issue.
Yeah, that is the primary job, I think, in the
Yes,
media.
that is the primary job of the media. Yes.
So, well, friend, today we are running short of the time, so we'll conclude the lecture here. And I also thank all of you for watching the lecture. And on your behalf, I thank Dr. Anand Pradhan with enlightening us with such a freedom of press, and with numerous instances which makes clear what does really freedom of press mean to us. Thank you very much.